All right, welcome everyone. It is now 1:05, so I will go ahead and get this webinar started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Processes and Procedures Ordinance informational webinar. In conformity with the Governor's Executive Order N-29-20 and due to concerns over COVID-19, this event is being conducted virtually. My name is Bonnie Kim, City Planner with the Los Angeles City Planning Department. Here with me today from our team is Hagu Solomon Carey, Patrick Whalen, Darby Whipple, and Jaime Espinoza. We will begin with an overview presentation of the proposed Processes and Procedures Ordinance. Following the presentation, we will use our remaining time to answer some questions and respond to comments. We recommend that you join today's webinar on a computer or by downloading the GoToWebinar app on your phone. If you are calling in to join this webinar, you will not be able to see or hear the video components of the presentation, and you will not be able to submit questions or comments via the question box in GoToWebinar. However, a recording of today's entire webinar will be made available on our department website at planning.lacity.org. We hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy out there. Now on to our presentation. First, a reminder that at any time during this presentation, you can enter a question or comment in the questions field of the control panel. Throughout this presentation, we will have staff on hand to assist. If your control panel is minimized, you can simply click on this orange arrow to expand it. If you have audio issues, feel free to change your audio output to computer audio or phone call. Please also note that as an attendee, you are automatically muted for the duration of this presentation. To start this presentation, let's first review the history of the ordinance, why it's important, and our goals in proposing the ordinance. The Processes and Procedures Ordinance has been in development for several years. Initial research began back in 2016, which was followed by the release of a draft ordinance and outreach in 2017 and 2018. On October 11th, 2018, the City Planning Commission, also referred to as the CPC, recommended approval of the proposed Processes and Procedures Ordinance with additional instructions to City Planning to incorporate technical corrections identified by the public when advancing the ordinance to the City Council. City Planning continued to receive community input after that CPC hearing and decided to extend additional time for both internal and external review of the ordinance. As a result, Planning has prepared a revised draft of the ordinance, which was released for public review on November 10th, 2020. This revised draft will eventually be taken back to the CPC for their consideration and action. City Planning has also prepared supplemental explanatory materials. The first is an annotated version of the ordinance to aid readers who are interested in tracking changes to the code provisions. Each section of the ordinance is marked with annotations outlining whether the provisions are new, amended in some way, or relocated from one section of the zoning code to another. There is also an updated fact sheet, which provides answers to frequently asked questions, and an interactive story map, which incorporates visual aids and graphics to explain the key concepts and changes proposed by the ordinance. All of these materials can be found on the Los Angeles City Planning website. Now that we've reviewed the background leading up to today's webinar, I'd like to spend a bit of time discussing the intent and goals of the ordinance. First, what is this Processes and Procedures Ordinance? It's one part of a larger effort to comprehensively revise the city's zoning code to become more accessible to the public. To be specific, it reorganizes the rules for reviewing projects or adopting land use policy while introducing a more user-friendly format. On a more technical note, this ordinance comprises the administrative provisions that set up the structure and home for the new zoning code by establishing a new Chapter 1A of the Los Angeles Municipal Code. So why does this ordinance matter? In a nutshell, it enables stakeholders at all levels of familiarity with the zoning code to know what the rules for project review are and how they can have a say in the process. Clear rules and timelines for project review help create an even playing field for all interested parties and increases transparency during the process. So how do we hope to achieve this goal? Through the concepts of standardization, consolidation, and centralization. We've created 2 short animations, which I will play next, to illustrate how we utilize these strategies to make improvements to the zoning code's processes and procedures. Please note, as stated earlier, if you are calling in to join this webinar, you will not be able to see or hear the videos. Instead, please change your audio output to computer audio. This first animation will cover the concepts of standardization and consolidation and runs just under 2 minutes in length. When we say processes were standardized and consolidated, what does that mean? The logic behind standardization and consolidation is based on understanding the difference between a process and procedures. The process can be described as the overall path for obtaining project approval, while the procedures are the individual steps in the path. With this understanding, we are able to compare processes with similar procedures and identify which ones can be consolidated. Our efforts to simplify the rules for project reviews start with a comparison between processes that have key similarities and procedures. In this example, we can see 3 separate processes, which have some differences, but share the same initial decision maker and appellate decision maker. What's different between the 3 processes in this example is the procedures for notification of public hearing, the time to act, and the appeal period, all of which have to do with time periods. It's no wonder that there is uncertainty about the rules when each process has its own slightly different time periods, for example. So how can we improve this situation and make the rules more clear? We've consolidated approximately 120 processes down to about 60 while maintaining the full variety of project reviews. Notice what is not being changed through standardization or consolidation: the regulation that tells you when a project has to go down a certain approval path, which we call the entitlement threshold. This ordinance instead focuses on what rules apply once a project is on a path. Next, I will play a second video that covers the concept of centralization, and it runs a quick 20 seconds. Processes and procedures are currently scattered throughout the zoning code, which makes the rules difficult to find. To make navigation easier, we've relocated the processes and procedures into a new centralized home, Article 13 of Chapter 1A of the Los Angeles Municipal Code. Both of these animations that I just played can also be viewed on the Processes and Procedures story map. Now that we've discussed the overarching why and how, this next section of the presentation will cover the specific policy and technical changes proposed in the ordinance. First, we have some changes relating to the requirements for notification of a public hearing. In today's code, the requirement for mail notice of a public hearing can range from 10 to 24 days. We are instead proposing that we have a standardized 21-day mail notice time period for all entitlements. Next, we also have proposed standardization for the mail notice distance. Today's code has requirements that currently range from adjacent and abutting properties, properties within 100 feet, and properties within 500 feet. We are proposing that the mailing radius instead be adjacent and abutting properties, properties within 300 feet, and properties within 500 feet. There's also some other changes related to notification requirements. One is that we are proposing to require that mail notice of public hearing be sent to certified neighborhood councils. Neighborhood councils are not currently required to receive mail notice. We're also proposing to require publication notice for preliminary parcel maps, tentative tract maps, and zoning code amendments. And lastly, we are proposing to require posting notice. So this is notification by putting a sign on site for the following entitlements of project compliance, project adjustment, and project review. We also have some changes proposed to appeal rights. First is a standardization of the appeal period. In today's code, the appeal period timelines can range from 10 to 15 days, and we are instead proposing that there is a standardized timeline of 15 days for all entitlements. So this would mean that you would have 15 days to file an appeal for any entitlement. We are also proposing a de novo standard of review for appellate decisions. In today's code, the appellate body considers whether the initial decision maker erred or abused their discretion on the initial decision. And instead, we would like to propose that a de novo standard of review be in effect, where the appellate body would consider the project as a whole without giving deference to the initial decision maker. So they are not instead, so the appellate body would not be considering if the initial decision maker made a mistake, but instead be making a decision based on the merits of the project. There are also some changes proposed to development rights. The first is in regards to vesting rights that are granted pursuant to the payment of plan check fees. In today's code, those vesting rights are lost if you increase or reduce your vested plans by more than 5%. We are instead proposing that you would lose those vesting rights if you increase the plans by more than 5% or reduce the plans by more than 10%. This is in essence giving more flexibility to applicants who end up building smaller than their plans were approved for. So it's just giving, we don't want to be penalizing folks for building less than what they're already approved to build. Then we are also planning to distinguish effectuation of a planning approval versus utilization of a building permit. So this is all in reference to how long your entitlement is valid for before it expires. Effectuation of approval would mean that city planning has reviewed your plans and cleared your conditions, whereas utilization of a permit would mean that building and safety has reviewed your plans after planning has cleared those conditions and issued your building permit. This also would result in a potentially extended validity period. Today's code simply gives you 3 years to utilize your entitlement. And by making this distinction, we would instead be allowing 3 years for the effectuation portion that city planning is responsible for, and up to an additional 3 years for the utilization period that building and safety is responsible for. Some other changes related to development rights. We are proposing to codify procedures for abandonment of approvals. This would mean that applicants who have received an approval but decide they no longer want to use that will now have a codified procedure to follow in requesting that abandonment. And we would also like to propose that vesting parcel maps could be filed. Currently, we only allow the filing of vesting tract maps. So this would just be allowing vesting parcel maps to be filed as well. There are also a few new processes that are being proposed as part of this ordinance. The first is the policy action process, which is a new process by which design standards or guidelines could be adopted by the City Planning Commission. Next, we have review or modification of an entitlement, which would allow approved entitlements to request a modification with limitations. And it's important to note that for this modification process, the decision maker on the modification would be the same decision maker as the original decision. And whatever public hearing requirements were included with the original entitlement would also apply to the modification request. Lastly, we have this alternative compliance process, which is a new process by which projects could request relief from a specific standard if the proposed alternative was equivalent to or exceeded the effectiveness of meeting the intent of the applicable standard. And alternative compliance would only be available as an option if the zoning code explicitly stated that alternative compliance was allowed for a specific standard. This is envisioned to be more relevant once the new zoning code has been applied. There is only one instance in today's zoning code which explicitly states that alternative compliance is an applicable entitlement request, and that is in relation to bicycle parking design standards. We are also proposing a few changes to existing processes. The first is the relationship between specific plan processes and the zoning code. Currently, when there's a conflict between the procedures in a specific plan and the zoning code prevails. We are instead proposing that the procedures in the specific plan should prevail instead. So this would empower the specific plans. We are also proposing the batching of GPA initiation requests. So this would create a window for general plan amendment initiation requests for applicants. This is simply a procedural amendment. It's not changing the standard of review that a general plan would have to go through. It's simply saying that the department could choose to receive those application requests in batches. Then we are also proposing a change to project review. We would propose that applicants could use that standardized review or modification of entitlement process to request modifications to a previously approved project review, which is not currently allowed today. And then lastly, we are also proposing to clarify the requirements to qualify as a deemed to be approved private street, while also providing further clarification on the proper procedures for filing CEQA appeals. There are also several name changes that are proposed as part of this ordinance. The first is the zoning administrator determination being changed to Class 1 CUP. Then we have the zoning administrator CUP being changed to Class 2 CUP, and then the APC and CPC CUP would be called a Class 3 CUP. So the thinking is that by changing those names to Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3, it's very clear from the least intensive to the most intensive levels of CUP. Then we are also proposing that site plan review be changed to project review. And this is because site plan review implies that we're only looking at site plans, but in reality, this entitlement requires us to review the project as a whole. We're also proposing to change administrative clearance to administrative review because clearance implies an automatic approval, whereas this is really a process by which we review plans for compliance. And then lastly, project permit compliance, project permit compliance design review board, project permit adjustment are all being proposed to take out the word permit, since permitting is more of a building and safety jurisdiction. So those processes would instead be named project compliance design review board, project adjustment, and then lastly, specific plan exception is also being proposed to be renamed to project exception to be consistent with the naming conventions that we've given to the specific plan processes. We also have a few changes proposed for decision makers. These 4 examples are the only instances in which a change in decision maker would happen. First is for the adjustment process. In today's code, it's a zoning administrator decision, and we are proposing that it instead be a director decision. Then we have evaluation of noncompliance, which is currently a director decision that we are proposing to become a zoning administrator decision. Similarly, with the nuisance abatement revocation process, which is currently a director decision, we'd like to propose that it instead be a zoning administrator decision. And specifically for the evaluation of noncompliance and the nuisance abatement revocation processes, this change is proposed because This would actually be codifying what is done in practice today. Currently, the director delegates his authority to the zoning administrator to process these types of cases. So this proposed change would just be, like I had stated, codifying what is current department practice. And then lastly, the mixed use CUP, which is currently the only CUP that the area planning commissions are responsible for as the initial decision maker. We are proposing that that CUP instead become a city planning commission CUP. I'll conclude today's presentation with an overview of the ordinance adoption timeline and next steps. We are currently here in the middle portion of this timeline in the sharing and consulting phase of the ordinance adoption process. As indicated by the description, now that the proposed ordinance has been released for public review, this phase is dedicated to consulting with the community and conducting outreach to receive feedback on the proposed changes. The feedback we receive will be incorporated into a staff recommendation report that will be presented to the City Planning Commission. We are tentatively scheduled to go before the City Planning Commission in spring of 2021. After the CPC takes action, the ordinance would then be presented to the Plum Committee of the City Council and eventually considered by the full City Council. So when will these new processes and procedures apply? While the precise timing of the legislative process is outside of City Planning's control, we do anticipate requesting a delayed effective date to allow the department to prepare for implementation of the new processes and procedures. This would include tasks such as preparing updated application forms, potentially updating our case tracking nomenclature, training for city staff, applicants, and the public, and a public awareness campaign. Lastly, while the rest of the new zoning code will be applied in phases through community plan updates, the administrative provisions of the processes and procedures ordinance will apply universally citywide on its effective date. No matter what your community plan update timeline is, or if you have new or existing zoning, every property will be under one unified system of processes and procedures. We hope you found that presentation informative. Here are some final points I'd like to cover before we move on to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. If you have not already done so, there are still appointment slots available for our upcoming virtual office hours later this month. These are informal opportunities to meet one-on-one with the planner and discuss your specific questions or comments. Office hour appointments are 20 minutes and will take place over the phone or through video conference, according to your preference. The link to book an appointment is included in the same email you received to register for this webinar. We will also be sharing a link in the chat box in the control panel. All questions and comments regarding the processes and procedures ordinance can be sent to myself at bonnie.kim@lacity.org. We ask that comments be submitted by February 15th, 2021, in order to ensure that we are able to incorporate such feedback into the staff recommendation report prior to the City Planning Commission hearing. Finally, comments may be submitted at any time during the adoption process to the associated council file number 12-0460-S4. I will hand it over to Hagu Solomon Carey to get the Q&A portion started.
Great, thank you very much, Bonnie. That was very informative. Good afternoon, everyone. Hagu Solomon Carey here. I just wanted to kick us off to the Q&A portion of our webinar today. And given the number of attendees, just giving a caveat that we may not be able to get to every question, but we'll do our best and we'll answer questions in the order received. With that, Bonnie, I will start us off by going to our first question. Give me a second as I organize my window. Okay, I think the first question refers to calendar days or business days. I'm assuming this is related to notification time period.
Correct. Pursuant to the city charter, we're going by calendar days.
Okay, great. The next question we have is, would revised vesting rights with regards to plan reduction allow for reduction of affordable while maintaining market rate units?
Could you repeat the question? I just want to make sure that I understand what's being asked.
Absolutely. Would revised vesting rights with regards to plan reductions allow for reductions of affordable while maintaining market rate units?
I don't believe that would be true. That is something that we had discussed when we were considering the proposal to allow folks to reduce their plans by up to 10% before they lost their plan check vesting rights. We took a few case studies and didn't find that to be true. Of course, we can't plan for every exception, but it is certainly our intention that we would not be allowing a loss of affordable housing units.
Great, thank you. Moving on, are you going to standardize size of notification on site?
I believe the hope is yes. That is something that we would be figuring out during that delayed effective date period when the department is busy preparing for implementation. The size requirements for the posting notice are really at the department's discretion. We've certainly looked at other jurisdictions' posting notice requirements to see, how we could better improve our own requirements. So the short answer, I suppose, is we'll be considering it.
Great. Next question we have is, are your days for hearing notice for subdivisions consistent with the MAP Act? Those notices must be 10 days.
Yes, so subdivisions are one of those areas where we really tried our best to not make amendments, is because we still must be consistent with the state MAP Act. And so that is one of the few, if only, exception to the proposed standardized notification time period, because we are really relying on we're still trying to be compliant with the state MAP Act. So subdivisions are one of the few categories of entitlements where there are some exceptions to the proposed standardized timelines.
Great. Next question we have is, will the modification of entitlements apply to specific plan compliance and CDPs?
Could you just repeat the last part of that question, please?
Mm-hmm. Modification of entitlements apply to specific plan compliance and CDPs, coastal development permits?
If by specific plan compliance you mean the project compliance entitlement, I believe the answer is yes, you would be able to use the modification process. For the coastal development permit, we are not changing those requirements. There's a coastal specific modification process, and they would not be using the standardized modification process. Basically, coastal and subdivisions are the two categories of entitlements that relate to other agencies' jurisdictions, and so we were very careful to really minimize any proposed changes to those categories.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. I'm not sure if I have this question quite right, given how it was typed in, but I'll give it a go and feel free to ask me to repeat. If the zoning code prevails, what needs to be done for the specific to prevail? I'm assuming it's specific plan to prevail. This question comes from a resident of Benedict Canyon, which is in an R1 low density area.
I see. I think I understand what's being asked. So the situation we're in today is that the zoning code provisions and certain specific plan provisions are in conflict, there are certain specific plans that say within the specific plan that those specific plan provisions should prevail. And then in conflict with that is that our zoning code is also saying that the zoning code should prevail. So by amending the zoning code to instead say that the specific plan provisions would prevail, that automatically, or the specific plans that already state that the specific plan provisions are supposed to prevail would just have that automatic, I guess, empowerment. So as long as your specific plan is already clear, explicitly states that those provisions are supposed to prevail, the specific plan would be the ultimate last word in which regulations apply to your property.
Thanks, Bonnie. The next one is just a clarifying question. Are you proposing that a ZA type approval would now be valid for 6 years?
It's not an automatic granting of 6 years. It's just saying you would get up to 3 years to get your conditions cleared, and then up to an additional 3 years to get a building permit issued. So I guess it would be a maximum time period of up to 6 years, but that doesn't mean that every entitlement will take 6 years to effectuate and utilized.
Excellent. Next question is, are the number of requested variances per a project and the percentage of deviation limited in the proposed ordinance?
Okay, so I think I understand what this question is asking, and it's a little bit of a complicated explanation. So as one of the animations explained, this ordinance is related to the rules that apply once a project is on an approval path. It is not changing any of the provisions related to which entitlement path a project is supposed to go down. So for example, let's say that this is just a hypothetical example. Let's say that mixed use requires mixed use of 500 units and 50,000 square feet of commercial space requires a CUP. This ordinance is not making any changes to that requirement that it go through a CUP approval path. Instead, it deals with the rules that apply once you've started your application for a conditional use permit. So, you know, how much you can get a deviation for and which of the regulations you can get a deviation for, that is not being changed at all by this ordinance.
Great. And another, I think, somewhat complicated question, but a good one nonetheless, is regarding tree removal. And the question, I think, boils down to how can new processes and procedures make it easier for city staff, including planning, public works, and others, to recommend changes to protected trees?
Yeah, that is a great question that our department is aware of and is in communication with the urban forestry and public works folks to try to figure out a better interdepartmental, interagency workflow. That is, the deficiencies with the current workflow are not necessarily due to zoning code requirements or specific zoning code regulations. It's more of a department working protocol. So we are in conversations with those tree-related departments to figure out how to better protect trees. We have a working group that's in regular communication with those folks. So we hope that eventually we will get to a point where we can have a better workflow between the departments to make sure that protected trees are considered closer to the beginning of the approval process as opposed to the end of the approval process. That is a completely separate effort from this ordinance, though. So it's not within the purview of what this ordinance is dealing with, but I do want to reassure you that the department is aware of this issue and is working to address it.
Excellent. The next question is regarding review of modifications. Is the total number of modifications limited per application?
The total number. I believe it is, there is a total cap of no more than 20% modification. So if, for example, you had requested a modification and already got that 20% within that first modification request, that's it, you've met your limit. There is no more modification available to you. However, if you had submitted a modification request and the modification, let's say, came out to only 10%, then you still have that remaining margin of the 10% to request in a subsequent modification. So there is a hard cap of no more than 20% modification, regardless of how that gets parsed out.
Thank you, Bonnie. Next question is regarding the classes of CUPs. In a class 3, how can you determine whether it's going to APC or CPC?
Right, so class 3 would mean that it is only the City Planning Commission, or so all class 3 CUPs are determined by the City Planning Commission. There was only one CUP that was previously, or that is currently considered by the APC, but as a part of the consolidation into that class 3 approval path, or that class 3 category of CUPs, that CUP is being rerouted to the City Planning Commission. So basically, that is what that class 1, class 2, class 3 nomenclature is set up to do. Class 1 is all zoning administrator approvals. Class 2 is the zoning administrator approved CUPs, and then a class 3 is only City Planning Commission CUPs. If this ordinance is adopted, that would mean there are no CUPs that would be determined by the Area Planning Commission.
Thanks, Bonnie. The next question says, you mentioned that there will be some modified processes related to CEQA appeal filings. What are those changes?
They're not necessarily changes, it's just further clarification on how the department will be processing CEQA appeals. Sorry, I misspoke a little. There is a specific addition to the CEQA appeals procedures in that we are adding a prohibition on improper segmentation, which is basically when somebody is trying to piecemeal their project for the purposes of the CEQA analysis. So we are proposing to add a section to the CEQA procedures that states, where improper segmentation of projects is prohibited, and if we find that you have committed that, there is a penalty and administrative review process to make sure that we catch that and that we address those situations.
Great, and I just want to take a moment to recognize all the kudos and congratulations you're also receiving, Bonnie. Moving on to the next question about utilization period. The question is, does utilization start with applying for plan check and end with completion of construction?
I believe it starts, yeah, it would apply with plan check, or basically after planning has cleared all of your conditions on the clearance tracking sheet. And then it ends with the building permit issuance, not with the completion of construction. So that is some of what we had tried to address, because the current code states that you only have 3 years until you have to actually be done with the construction, and that we found in our experience has been too narrow of a validity period for projects, especially the larger, more complicated projects. And so it is instead, the utilization period is 3 years to get your building permit issued.
Okay, great. The next question is regarding alternative compliance. In addition to bicycle parking, what alternative compliance items are in the pipeline?
That's a great question. I can't, I guess, give a definitive answer because this ordinance is not the vehicle through which alternative compliance would get triggered for certain zoning code standards and regulations. But I do know that the downtown community plan update and the associated zoning code components that would get applied on the ground through that community plan update does include some standards that could use the alternative compliance process. I believe they're mostly in relation to the frontage standards of the downtown community plan zoning code components, but you would have to check that community plan and the draft zoning code for that community plan for the specific design standards that alternative compliance would be applicable to.
Great, thank you. The next question is, are any of the state specified timelines for affordable housing considered in these policies?
I mean, any state requirements still apply. You know, our local zoning code does not necessarily override, you know, those state requirements. So, you know, the specific iterations of the, I guess, relationship between our time periods and the state required time periods, we're certainly, the department is like working on and has tried to figure out to the best of our knowledge. It would be hard to say definitively, you know, in a single answer. All I can say is that we are aware that there are state timelines. We are, to the best of our knowledge, compliant with those timelines. And like I had said, during that delayed effective date period, we will be very focused on making sure that implementation of the proposed ordinance is done smoothly and in compliance with any other requirements.
Great. Yeah, similar, I would say, to how we function today. No matter what's in our code, when the state mandates come down, we obviously adjust and comply. I think that's really the only way to do it, given how active the state legislature has been. Moving on to our next question is about the batching of GPAs, or the ability to. How long is the batching period for GPAs intended to be, i.e. 2 months, 6 months, etc.? And how is this different from the current practice where the management team reviews them in a regularly scheduled meeting?
We do not at this moment in time have a specific batching period. The proposed change is really more enabling language. It would allow the department to set a batching period, but it does not specify, you know, 2 months or 6 months or a year. I believe there are, you know, in the past, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, when there was the department was in the practice of some sort of batching. They were done on a quarterly basis. So it basically has not been determined yet. And then for how this would be different from the current practice where the management team reviews them in regularly scheduled meetings. Well, you know, it's too early to say because, again, it would just be enabling, basically giving the department the option to set up this batching system. But this is, again, just a proposed ordinance. It hasn't been adopted yet. So there are no current changes to the department's process of considering general plan amendment initiation requests.
Okay, the next question has to do with notification and neighborhood councils. I think you may have covered this, but what about requiring the affected neighborhood council to be included in notification?
Yes, well, I'm glad for this question because it is a change that was specifically in response to the feedback that we had heard on the previous drafts of the ordinance. So for those of you who are familiar with the current zoning code, there's no notification requirement for neighborhood councils in today's code. We do, as a department, provide early notification, which is notification of an application being filed. That is a courtesy notice by the department. It's not a code requirement. So that's separate from the required notice of public hearing. Since we had heard that, certified neighborhood councils should be required to receive mail notice, we have added that as a new change to this draft of the ordinance. And it basically is just stating that anytime mail notice of a public hearing is required for any parties, the respective or relevant neighborhood council needs to also be included in that mail notice requirement.
Great, very important. Thank you, Bonnie. I do see a note to speak up, so I'll do better. The next question has to do with the new modification process. Is there a limit in the amount of change that will be allowed to be considered as a modification as opposed to requiring a new project application? For example, a change in density of 20% or less?
Yes, there is a 20% cap there, and I believe it's specific to like the physical dimensions of the project. I would have to check the specific language to be able to give you the details, but but in essence, yes, there is a 20% limit on the maximum modification that you could receive.
Okay, this next question is an interesting one. It says, will there be any documentation specifically analyzing the effects of the ordinance on public participation in planning decisions?
Any documentation? I'm not sure I understand the question, but
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very good question, and it really has an eye towards, our intent of the goal, intents and goals of the ordinance. I don't know that we've spent time explicitly thinking about tracking or metrics on increased public participation in decisions, but it is a good thought to consider.
Yes, I would echo, Hagu's comment that, we hadn't thought about it, but it is a good suggestion that we will have to consider, thinking through the implications of how we would quantify public participation, and how would we, what goals we could set to indicate increased public participation. It's hard to say because also there's a lot of intangible, facets to the time that it requires to get an entitlement approved, or just how long a project review process would take. There are so many factors to consider that it wouldn't be a simple exercise, but it's certainly an intriguing idea that we will be considering.
Excellent. The next question, are these changes now requiring ministerial processes to go through a discretionary process for a ZA issue?
No. So again, we are not changing what types of projects go through which entitlement paths. We are simply changing or trying to standardize, what rules apply once you are on an approval path. So, but to your point about ministerial versus discretionary, I do want to make it clear that there are no plans to change any currently discretionary process to a ministerial process. Any process that requires a public hearing and notice will continue to require a public hearing and notice. And then we are simply changing the name of our standardized ministerial process, which today is called administrative clearance, but we are proposing to rename it administrative review. So that is really the only changes proposed in this ordinance to the ministerial process of administrative review.
Good point to clarify. Thanks, Bonnie. Our next question is, will the changes to effectuation and utilization be applied to existing permits or only to new permits/entitlements granted after adoption of the ordinance?
I'm sorry, Hagu, could you repeat that? I believe your audio dropped out for a bit at the first half of the question.
Okay, apologies. The question is, will the changes to effectuation and utilization be applied to existing permits or only to new permits or entitlements granted after adoption of the ordinance?
So that's definitely a relevant question as well. We do not plan to apply the effectuation utilization changes to current permits since this ordinance is still just in draft proposal form. It has not been adopted. And then even after it is adopted, we are planning to request that effective date delay. Hasn't been determined exactly how long, but we've discussed potentially a 6-month effective date delay, and that during that time period is when we would hash out these very specific technical questions about when projects in the pipeline and whether they are subject to the new rules or the old rules. It's something that we have not worked out yet because it's a little premature, but we know that that is something that we will have to clarify and make sure is clear to potential applicants and any projects in the pipeline.
Great, thank you. This next question is quite detailed. Let me know if you want me to repeat it. It's regarding thresholds for requesting modifications. What is the threshold for requesting a modification to an approved entitlement? Will this process eliminate the existing administrative process whereby planning can issue modifications to conditions which are unclear or inconsistent with the approved plans?
I think I'm going to have to ask you to repeat that one more time.
Yeah, I think the author of the question is just wondering, you know, will the modification for an approved entitlement process that we're proposing take the place of planning's ability to issue modifications to conditions which are unclear or inconsistent with approved plans? And is there a specific threshold basically a threshold or limit for when a modification would be appropriate?
I see. Okay. So it's not necessarily a threshold so much as the review or modification of entitlement process is essentially triggered by the code requirements. So the way that the new process and procedures are set up, each entitlement section has a subsection that states how can I modify this entitlement, or how could I modify this approval? And in that subsection is where it would state if a modification was available, and if so, which modification process. So in regards to the standardized review or modification of entitlement, the processes that I'm aware of that do allow the use of that modification mechanism is the director determination process, project review, which is the new name for site plan review, project compliance, project exception, and alternative compliance. So those are all of the categories of entitlements that could use this standardized modification of entitlement process, which again is capped at that 20% maximum modification. And then we are carrying over the existing plan approval process for the entitlements such as the CUP and the variance and the adjustment. So processes that in today's code use the plan approval process for modifications will continue to use that plan approval process. And then separately, for clarifications or corrections that don't rise to the level of a full modification, we do still have, you know, our sort of department's ability to issue clarifications. So there's sort of like varying levels of the types of actions that are available once an entitlement has been approved.
Great answer. I think that gets at the heart of the question. Okay, the next question is, are any changes to be made to RDP approval?
I
assume that.
Yes, can you,
Yeah.
sorry, could you clarify? My brain is not quite clear on what the RDP approval is referring to.
I felt the same way, Bonnie. I think we may be discussing residential development. I'm not familiar with the RDP acronym. It could be that or a mistype and referring to CDP, which you covered briefly.
Okay. Yeah, if possible, and apologies for any inconvenience, whoever submitted that question, could you clarify what you meant by RDP approval? And hopefully we can get back to that once we're clear on what you were referring to.
Okay, I'll note that and look out for that author's follow-up. Next question. Will this eliminate TOC or PSH incentives in specific plan areas?
Will this eliminate TOC or I don't believe so. There's certainly no intention to overrule or eliminate existing affordable housing related incentives. And it does not, this ordinance does not, it does not overrule any specific plans. In fact, it's doing the opposite. So, you know, any changes to a specific plan would only, or any changes to a specific plan's requirements or provisions would be applied through a separate specific plan amendment. There's no changes being, I guess, implemented to specific plans through the provisions of this ordinance.
Yes, well put. I would just also draw the distinction. Perhaps the author is wondering about alternative methods to comply with TOC, and that typically happens through a community plan process. And just to reiterate Bonnie's point, we're not changing any entitlement pathways in process and procedures. Let's see. Next question. Is the CEQA appeal segmentation process separate from City Council review of the appeal? Will you please provide additional information?
Yeah, it is not separate. It is discussing the same thing. It's just providing additional details, procedural details on how the city planning would consider those CEQA appeals. So it's just, it was let me see if I can give you the specific code section that contains those CEQA procedures, because they're quite lengthy and were created in coordination with our city attorneys. So I don't want to necessarily simplify them too much or misspeak on them, but let me make sure I can give you the appropriate code section so that you can see for yourselves what is being added to the CEQA procedures. So if you're interested in looking at those CEQA provisions, you should look at section 13B.11.1 of chapter 1A of the proposed ordinance. That's towards the very end of the ordinance, so feel free to just skip along to that last section. It's the last section before the definitions.
Okay, great. The next question also has to do with modifications and the 20%. I believe the question is asking 20% of what? RFA, how is the 20% determined?
Yes, that is a very good question. So again, I don't want to misspeak, so let me see if I can pull up the specific wording of that modification limit. If you'll just give me a moment to look that up. Okay, so again, also you can confirm for yourself in section 13B.5.4 of chapter 1A of the draft ordinance. And the way that it is drafted, it states that the maximum deviation, so we say modification for purposes of this section, a modification means any changes in the proposed physical development, planned operation, or conditions of approval. In no event can any modification or series of modifications allow a use, single deviation, or series of deviations to exceed the maximum deviation allowed by this chapter or chapter 1. Maximum deviation. Use, single deviation, or series of deviations from this chapter or chapter 1 which was not approved as part of the original action, or any modifications which would result in an increase or reduction of the physical development, planned operation, or conditions of approval on the original action by more than 20%. So I believe the portion that you're specifically asking about is the any modifications which would result in an increase or reduction of the physical development, planned operation, or conditions of approval on the original action.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. Okay, the next question is, why was the change in appeal review standards warranted? Why was the change in appeal review standards warranted?
I see. So I believe this question is asking about that proposed change to a de novo standard of review for appellate decisions. And this is a great question. So currently, the specific the standard of review that is stated in the code for certain entitlements, but not necessarily consistently for all entitlements, is that the appellate body should consider whether the initial decision maker erred or abused their discretion in making the initial decision. So and we felt that it was an improvement to switch to a standardized de novo review because, one, the current system is not applied consistently. It's not consistent throughout the code, and it's not necessarily consistent in practice because of the confusion in the code. So we hope by adopting a standardized, like a true standardized standard of review, that will help make appellate decisions more consistent across all types of entitlements, across all geographies. And then also that phrase error or abuse of discretion is basically hard to quantify. So when we have to, how do you prove that there was specifically an error or abuse of discretion? That's something that we have found to be a challenge. And so in consultation with our city attorneys, they felt that this de novo standard of review would basically be a much more consistent baseline to use. It also essentially empowers the appellate decision maker to be able to consider, the full record, consider the project as a whole. They're not just limited to a very technical, narrow scope of review. So for all of those reasons, we felt that a de novo standard of review for appellate decisions would be an improvement for our process and procedures.
Thanks, Bonnie, very comprehensive. The next question, I think, speaks to our current state of affairs regarding the pandemic and changing economic conditions. And the question really is, do we have a rough ETA on when applicants for the new modification process will be allowed to file?
Yeah, so I guess the short answer is no, we don't have a rough ETA, simply because the legislative portion of the ordinance adoption process is not within our department's control. It really depends on how long the city council takes to consider the ordinance and potentially make amendments or discuss it. So our hope is that the city council will be able to consider this ordinance this year, within this year. But again, even if it were adopted within this year, we would still be requesting that effective date delay so that we could work out these specific types of questions of which projects in the pipeline use the new process and procedures, what will the cutoff date be, how will we work out all of those specific projects in the pipeline. So right now, it's just simply too early to say. It would be pure speculation. But it's a, I guess, good note for us to consider, since that there is some urgency or some desire to see this happen quickly.
Great, thank you. And we did get clarity. Thank you for everyone who responded. Of course, RDP, meaning redevelopment project. So going back to the initial question, are any changes to be made to the redevelopment project approval process?
Okay, thank you for that clarification. There are not any changes specifically proposed for redevelopment plan project, but I am aware that the redevelopment plan, I guess, project approvals essentially use the specific plan processes. They refer to those specific plan processes, such as project compliance and project exception. So in that sense, some of the standardized timelines and notification requirements that we are proposing for those specific plan processes, since the redevelopment plan, I guess, processing does reference those processes, it will be sort of a secondary effect. But this ordinance is not actively trying to make changes to the redevelopment process. I hope that was clear. If there are changes, it's simply a byproduct of the standardization that we're, some of the standardized changes that we're making to the specific plan processes.
Great, and thank you for clarifying, everyone. The next question, I think, piggybacks on the previous question about impacts on public participation and how we may or may not be tracking. This one is slightly different and takes the approach of potential increase of modifications, and how will the department evaluate the impacts of the newly adopted policies and procedures as they relate to modification of entitlements. I would guess the same answer applies, Bonnie, but feel free to step in. My thought is, this is a good point. Thank you for raising it. And I think we haven't yet outlined what our mechanism for tracking any consistent changes in how public and project applicants participate in each one, but definitely something worth taking back to the drawing board and considering.
Yes, that is a great point to raise. Yeah, it's hard for us to answer that now, but it is certainly a good tip to get us started, to think about how we would be able to quantify any changes in the type or number of modification requests we get. I think some of that we hope to be able to work out when we update our case tracking nomenclature. We are able to do some level of case processing analytics with our current system, but it doesn't necessarily capture the true variety and type of entitlement cases. Some of the categories are quite broad. So we're hoping that, that effective date delay, where we think about how to implement these new processes and procedures, will give us a good timely opportunity to really reconsider our case tracking system and how we could better set it up to make that level of analytics possible.
Good point, Bonnie. Case tracking will be a major component of our rollout and our nomenclature as well. Okay, the next question is a little bit more of a nuanced dive, which I believe the remaining questions might be kind of in the same vein. This one is about non-compliance. If an illegal use was approved, say, via a zone variance and includes conditions for that use, and do not file for a building and safety change of use permit, are we in a sense allowing the use without a permit for 3 years, or can we include a condition that a permit shall be issued within a shorter time period, i.e. 60 days, to ensure no ongoing adverse impacts? Quite a bit to unpack there.
Yes. Could I request that you repeat that one more time, so I make sure I understood all of that?
Yes, absolutely. So with regard to non-compliance, say an illegal use was approved via zone variance and includes conditions for that use, and I'm assuming they're saying they don't file for building and safety change of use permit, are we in essence allowing the use without a permit for 3 years? Or could we include a condition that a permit shall be issued within a shorter time period, 60 days or so, to avoid adverse impacts?
Okay, I think I wouldn't necessarily rule it out, only because even though I would think it's unlikely that our department would be in the habit of issuing an approval for an illegal use. I would hope that we would do our best to make sure that we're not, issuing approvals for something that should not really be getting an approval. But we are a large city, things fall through the cracks, so I don't want to say it could never happen. If it did, we do still have the ability to request to include a condition that would request that, or that would require the applicant to have to come back to the department, within a certain period of time, so that we can review the approval and ensure that the project is complying with those conditions. So there are mechanisms that are built into the zoning code that we could use to require those types of projects to have to come back to the department more frequently than that just initial 3-year effectuation period. So I would hope that this is a very rare occurrence, but if it were, we do have mechanisms for the department to review those and check for compliance with conditions. And if they were not compliant, then we would go on to the abatement revocation process.
Great, and I should just add that if any specific question requires some additional follow-up, please feel free to email Bonnie. I believe her email is still up on the last slide of the presentation. I also want to acknowledge and affirm all the comments that are being received. We will be, through GoToWebinar, able to record these comments. So if I'm not reading them out loud, it's because they're not a question per se, but please note that we are taking stock of them. The next question, Bonnie, is how will this apply to projects that may be ongoing with different nomenclature prior to the adoption of the ordinance? Will all new forms and radius maps be needed for legal noticing process?
Right, so you really got to the heart of the, I guess, implementation questions that we will be considering. It is on our radar. That is definitely what we will be, what we know that we have to address prior to adoption of the ordinance. We all will be thinking about how to make sure that we capture all of those projects that are already in the pipeline. We do have, we will be producing a sort of comparison table so that it's clear, projects that were previously called this. So for example, if a project was previously called site plan review and it's in the pipeline, we have a table that will be able to tell the planners and the public, like, oh, well, site plan review is now called project review. So we are able to do that matching exercise. But really, it's premature for us to be able to say exactly how we would do it, but it is certainly an item on our list of tasks that we know we have to address in order to ensure like effective implementation. And then in regards to the part of the question about new forms and radius maps being needed, yeah, if you were already in the pipeline and had done all of your noticing, and we're already at the part of the process where the decision maker is working on a letter of determination, you would already still be there would be no new notice that you would have to provide, because that would be completely how should I say, you wouldn't need to re-notice just because we've changed the name. You've already done that part of you've already completed that part of the process. So hopefully, if you're already in the pipeline, have gotten past the hearing date, you wouldn't have to re-notice. But for new projects, we would have to consider, we are going to update all of our application forms. So please note that, yes, once the ordinance is in effect, all of our application forms and potentially our noticing paperwork will look different, hopefully for the better. But yes, that is all what we will be working on as this ordinance goes through the adoption process.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. Okay, this question has again to do with the relationship between specific plans and the current code. I'm not sure if this will be clear, so let me know if you need me to repeat, but the question is, if the specific plan would prevail the current conflict, not sure which one would prevail. Perhaps you can just reiterate that relationship again for us.
Right, so right now, our code currently states that when there's a conflict between the procedures in the zoning code and the procedures in a specific plan, the procedures in the zoning code will prevail. Then we also have some specific plans that currently state the opposite. So those specific plans state that if there's a conflict between the procedures in the zoning code and the procedures in the specific plan procedures will prevail. So given that conflict, currently the zoning code provisions would prevail. However, because we are aware of that conflict and believe that the specific plans should be given that deference, that the specific plans are targeted and more calibrated to that local geography or specific policy intent, that those specific plan provisions should prevail. And for that reason, we are proposing that we would amend the zoning code to state that the specific plan provisions would prevail instead. So then both the zoning code and those specific plans would be consistently stating that the specific plan is the ultimate authority.
Thanks, Bonnie. Okay, this question is regarding zoning determinations. Why not change them to A, B, and C instead of 1, 2, and 3 to avoid confusion between old and new designations?
Well, I can certainly, I guess, take that into consideration. A, B, and C versus 1, 2, and 3. I don't know that the 1, 2, and 3 is necessarily more confusing than an A, B, and C, but as the key point was that they're renamed to be indicative of the level of intensity. So 1 being the least intense, 3 being the most intense. We could certainly consider A, B, and C as an alternative. So I've written it down. Taken note of it. I can't promise that we'll necessarily make that change, but it's been noted.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is the modification of entitlement limited to just the matter requested by the applicant, or is the entire entitlement under review and potentially exposed?
The modification request the decision maker would be considering just the modification that's approved. They would not be overturning, the original action just as a part of the modification review. I hope that made sense. So they're not going to overturn what was originally approved. since that's not part of what they're reviewing as part of the modification request.
Got that, yes. Looks like the remaining notes from authors are really more comments as opposed to questions. Some of them are a little bit less central to processes and procedures, but given the fact that we have such a large audience and those folks took the time to attend, I certainly am happy to share. One question or comment, I should say, says, please let the public know if there has been a noticeable change in participation since DCP meetings went online due to COVID-19, i.e. attendance at ZA hearings, APC hearings, etc. Again, I think I just, if you don't mind, Bonnie, would just say, not necessarily central to processes and procedures, but the comment in question is well noted. I think anecdotally what I can say is outside of those more formal hearing settings, I think our team has definitely seen an increase in participation since going online. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, Bonnie.
No, just would like to reiterate the same, that anecdotally we've heard from our counterparts in the department that outreach events and these types of information sessions and some project hearings have had noticeable increases in public participation. But again, that's just anecdotal. We don't have definitive numbers on that. But for the record, yes, the move to virtual hearings and meetings has resulted in increased participation from an anecdotal perspective.
Okay, and then we have some later questions, or more recent questions that I think are getting more to implementation, which we'll do our best to answer. Will the process be the same regarding noticing? So prior to submittal to planning, you go to BTC and get the receipt?
Yeah, that's another one of those that it's premature to say at the moment. That is also part of what we know that we have to consider and address as part of the implementation practices. Similar to, for example, the size requirements for a posting notice. Those types of procedures are not necessarily delineated in the code. It's left to the discretion of the department to reconsider. So we certainly have an opportunity to reconsider that and really think about what would be more efficient way to get that noticing done. There's, can't promise anything, but other than to say that it is on our radar and we are considering, how can we better, how can we process those notice requirements in a more efficient way. So basically, I guess, stay tuned once the ordinance is adopted and we're in that implementation preparation period.
Great. When will these new policies take place, Bonnie?
It's hard to say because it really depends on how long it takes to make it to the City Planning Commission and then make it through the Plum Committee and then form in legality through the City Attorney's Office before the final vote to adopt the ordinance by the City Council. So everything from the City Planning Commission hearing onwards is basically not within the department's ability to control. So, we know that in communications with the council offices and the commissioners that there is an interest in seeing this ordinance get adopted in a timely fashion. So I think that bodes well for this ordinance making it through the legislative process by this year, hopefully before the end of the year, but it's really hard to say. And then with that, we still have that effective date delay, likely a 6-month effective date delay, just based on our experience with some of the other citywide ordinances that we've had to figure out how to implement properly. So given all of that, it could be, quite a while before these new rules are in effect. Likely, and this is just, you know, a best guess. Likely they would not be in effect until next year at the earliest.
Agreed, and our hope is certainly to move it as fast as possible, but obviously with respect and deference to the legislative process. But do be in touch with your local representatives so that any urgency on your part can be kind of conveyed to the decision makers at both the committee and full council level. Okay, we just have a few more questions, Bonnie. The next one is, will any entitlements have shorter timelines to act from planning in order to help streamline TOC and affordable housing projects?
I don't believe there are any shortened time to acts. I believe there's for the most part, we've tried to standardize a 75-day time to act for all entitlements. There are some exceptions for example, I believe like general plan amendments or some of the other legislative entitlement or legislative actions that may have a 90-day period of a time to act. And then I believe for, but for the most part, we've tried to standardize a 75-day time to act. And then, but with the caveat that, you know, as we are carrying over a provision from the current code that, you know, is often used today where, you know, that time to act may be extended upon mutual consent between the applicant and the decision maker. So, I wouldn't be able to say that we've necessarily shortened any time to acts for the planning entitlements. We are certainly hopeful that, you know, with better rules and more accessible rules, you know, some of that confusion about, you know, who's the decision maker, how long do they have to act, you know, how long do I have to appeal, those types of questions are easy to navigate and get answers to. And so hopefully that will contribute to a more transparent, accessible system. But it's hard to say. There's no guarantee that, or even any necessarily intention that projects would get approved faster.
Thanks. Again, a question on modifications. If a modification is issued, then does the 20% total apply to the current owner or run with the land as usual with entitlements?
It would not, basically, are you asking, like, for example, if somebody had a, let's say, whatever, an original entitlement, then they had requested a 20% modification, and then the ownership of that property changed, would that new owner then be able to get an additional 20% modification? And I believe the answer is no, because that modification is tied to the original action, not to the original owner. So it's a modification of the entitlement. So we would still have that information available to us, and we would be able to track to make sure that that modification is not, there's no loophole to that you can just continue to stack 20% modification on top of another 20% modification just by changing ownership. You know, that is part of our case tracking system applicability, since we do include property's address as part of the information that we need in order to process a case. So I believe the answer would be no. You would not get access to additional modification margin just because you've experienced a change of ownership.
Okay, Bonnie, well, thank you so much for answering those questions so comprehensively. There are definitely some comments in the question comment box that we'll be taking note of. There's a few that I just want to pay homage to. One here says, there should be a speedier timeline between initiating a planning process and needing to break ground on a project. There was also another comment regarding coastal development as it relates to the mixed-use CUP project and the proposed change from APC to CPC. The sentiment is that it's problematic for the coastal zone where there's unique state laws that apply, including the Coastal Act and the Mello Act. The sentiment seems to be that City Planning Commission may have less exposure and experience with that. And so we take that comment and thank you for that very much. We definitely understand that the coastal zone has and will likely continue to pose some complexities for when we do citywide code amendments, including, of course, this one. Others, I think that may cover most of it, Bonnie. I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to participate. We've lost a few participants, but overall stayed strong with still 83 people. And with that, Bonnie, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Hagu, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. If we were not able to answer a question or respond to your comment, likely because it was very specific, please do feel free to follow up with me by email or sign up for an office hour appointment. Those are intended, again, to be those sort of one-on-one informal opportunities to discuss, any of your concerns or suggestions regarding the ordinance. So I believe, given that there are no more questions coming in, we'll conclude the Q&A portion here and conclude today's informational webinar. Again, thank you everyone for sticking around and participating. We hope that you stay safe and healthy and have a great rest of your day.